Hi, I'm Tamara, author of the Trauma Beat book and host of this, the Trauma Beat podcast. I don't usually mention this, but before the Trauma Beat, I self-published a novel called All the Bumpy Pebbles. It's about the domestic sex trafficking of women and girls, and though a work of fiction, it's inspired by the very real stories shared with me by victims and survivors. Now, I don't usually mention this book when I talk about my work because, well, I struggle with it. And after listening to this episode, perhaps you'll understand why. What you're about to hear is my conversation with a fierce advocate for victims and survivors of human trafficking, and someone who showed me how wrong I was getting things when I thought my very good intentions while writing and publishing my first book were good enough. Here it is. Okay, Michèle, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
I'm Michèle Anderson, and I am an anti-human trafficking advocate.
Okay, so Michèle, you are definitely underplaying yourself. You've worked in this field for decades, working with human trafficking survivors in Toronto, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So there's something I want to just point out. You just introduced yourself as Michèle Anderson, which might feel very normal for anybody listening to or watching this podcast. But you and I, we've had some history over the last few years because, and we'll get into this, I think, later, how you and I are paths first crossed that I'm aware of. And, but you were in my book, The Trauma Beat, and I think in one or two chapters. And initially, I think in the first draft, you were only identified by your first name, Michèle. And then I don't remember what point in the editing process we got to that you said, you know what? I want you to identify me by my first and last name. So can you just tell me a little bit about that journey and why maybe you were hesitant to have yourself identified by your full name and why you're comfortable doing so now?
It speaks to I would say the whole journey of doing this work as I'm going to say almost as a first responder, and just the impact of, as you've mentioned, decades of exposure to lots and lots of trauma, firsthand incidents, stories with the young women that I've supported, but also my own sort of trauma and having to deal with being very much a part of the media and a media blitz that happened, I'm going to say around 2014. For me, I was very much, I'm going to say the poster person. I don't want to say poster child, but poster person in regards to this issue of human trafficking. And I had been approached to speak to on this issue because I had been doing the work behind the scenes, I'm going to say, for years and years. So what seemed like a really good idea at the time, because I wanted to get the message out that this was a serious problem that we have here, I just was, I ended up being, I'm going to say, inundated with media requests, which I never felt I was able to decline, and I didn't decline. And I did that for years, I would say up until 2018. And then it just was getting to be too much for me. I had fear for my safety. I had fear for the safety of my children. And it was impacting me in a really big way. And so I made the request to be removed. And I call it the right to be forgotten. And we will get to that later in the podcast. But that's the language that I used when I was speaking to the agency and saying, I want the right to be forgotten. I really actually just want to be invisible. I don't want anybody to recognize my name, my image. I don't want people coming up to me on the street, because that's what was happening to me. Also, I remember being in a bank, and it was like Christmas Eve, and someone pointed at me and said, "Oh, you're that human trafficking lady." And like, full
Wow.
on in front of the bank. And it was a lot. It was a lot for me to carry. Like my buckets were full and overflowing. So sort of getting back to where, you and I were, like with the trauma beat, and also your book prior to that, right, Tamara?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was, some interaction, but it was like third party. I was giving information in regards to, survivors and consent, and I still, at that point, I didn't want my name used, and I sort of steered into using my first name for your book, The Trauma Beat, and then I just I don't know, I just was at a better place for myself, and I just thought, I've done this work for so long. This is also, I want to put a name to this. I'm going to say this incredible history of work that I've got, and be able to share it. So it was a significant shift, and I gave it a great deal of thought, and those were my reasons for changing my mind and agreeing to have my full name used for the book, The Trauma Beat.
Can I just ask you, Michèle, because some people might be thinking, okay, she worked with and continues to work with human
Yeah.
trafficking victims and survivors. Why would you feel that fear? Because I think many journalists, myself included as a journalist, if I were to go and speak with an advocate who's not the complainant in court or the victim or survivor in court, and they say, no, I don't want you to use my name, I'm not comfortable with it, I might say, well, why not? Like, what do you have to be afraid of?
Right. So I think, especially if you are involved in the criminal court system, and I was a lot of my cases, and a lot of them were high profile cases. So there was a lot of exposure in court with, defense counsel, crown attorneys, but mainly it was the accused. So the accused was there. The accused could see who I was. In I don't know, I didn't speak to the accused, but in my mind, I'm assisting in the interference of their ability to continue exploiting young women.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also, several times, I've been called as a witness quite a few times. So I was giving testimony in these trafficking cases and had to take the stand. So um, that 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 was a lot of exposure. So I was having to, um, you know, answer very difficult questions, especially from defense counsel, with, the accused sitting in the box, just sometimes giving me the death stare,
Yeah.
or, or, give like inappropriate gestures, or doing things, doing something like this, you
Wow.
know?
And anybody listening, Michèle just made a hand gesture like cutting your neck kind of thing.
Right. And so if you in the courtroom, for the most part, the accused is somewhat behind. So the defense and the crown are facing forward. They're
Yeah.
not looking at the accused, which is behind,
Yes.
beside or behind.
Yeah. In the
Um,
prisoner's box, if they're sitting in the
yeah, in the
prisoner's
prisoner's
box,
box.
they're
So
exactly.
they're not seeing that they don't have eyes on this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So um, I was in, I was definitely intimidated, like
Mm-hmm.
intimidated many times, many,
Yeah.
many, many, many times. And I would say not just with the accused, but I can think of one situation in particular, a very litigious and a very, very aggressive, the most aggressive defense counsel I've ever had to deal with. And he just made my life a misery, not just mine, but also the complainant, and also and the family. It was a horrific ordeal.
Mm.
So I feared for my safety, um and that was just accumulative, right? So it just there's that whole compounding of that trauma and that exposure and that exposure. And I think there was a case that he was convicted of human trafficking, but he was going to be paroled into my neighborhood, and I did not feel safe. I was looking out my window, cars would pull up. And so I was just coming out of that, Tamara, when I reconsidered and decided to consent to the full use of my name and my image again, because my image is online. Yeah.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Michèle. And I gotta say, I, to a far greater extent, but I can relate to a lot of what you were saying, because just to let our listeners know, human trafficking was something that I covered extensively, specifically when I was a print reporter working for the Toronto Sun. For a few years, I did a lot of stories about it, interviewed a lot of survivors, sat in on a lot of court cases. And I got to say, the accused in those, the offenders, I'll say, because I can't think of any case that I covered where they weren't convicted.
Right. Yeah.
It's a very different kind of accused, where they are very bold, and they, like, even me, just a journalist sitting in the body of the courtroom, I was quite often the only journalist there. They would stare at me, they would smile, like smirk sort of thing, and just very bold. And it's very unsettling. And I reported on human trafficking like very heavily for a few years, and I had a lot of nightmares at that time. My husband was trafficking me or whatever, because this is a crime that comes with a lot of violence and sexual violence and threats and all of that stuff. But I continued to report on it as a TV journalist to a lesser extent. But you were in this for decades, so I get it. But I wanted you to expand on that so journalists could understand why, when maybe they're going and talking to somebody they would consider like a talking head, the expert on it,
right.
Why that person might be hesitant to share their name. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, there's so much in there that we're going to come back to, but can you just start out by telling me, Michèle, in your experience, how has the media historically covered sex trafficking, and has this changed over the years? Because you've been doing this work since the 80s, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So I started doing street outreach in 1989, 1990. So I was actually, we had this big bus, and it was all street level. And so that's when I started all like this body of work. So yes, for one thing, it was print. So in terms of the media, so it's not, of course, maybe on microfiche, it's got a lifeline or whatever for decades. But it's not like these articles are just in your face, which is different from the online reporting that
it's not on social media. It doesn't live there forever if someone Googles you.
It was just like, it was in print. But it's interesting, because I was going through some of my archives, and I've got a couple of things here. So in the year 2000, the language that was being used was child hookers need help now. We would never see that headline now, right?
I remember a headline when I was at the Toronto Sun. The headline, I think, said teen hookers something. And like, reporters don't write the headlines. We usually don't even know what they are until the day of. But yeah, I mean, thinking of that now, it just makes me cringe. Anyway, continue. It made me cringe then, but it's crazy.
No, it's crazy. And so I think when I think on it, it's also the language that was used. So, child hookers, juvenile prostitutes, teen hookers. It was all very derogatory, and there was no compassion or empathy for the young women and girls that were caught in this web. They were bad girls. They were just making stupid decisions, and not that they deserved what they got, but there was this huge judgment, right? Like, what were they thinking? Of course, this is going to happen to them, right? And so that's a huge shift in I would say in that lens. Also, the other language that was used. So the traffickers were not referred to as traffickers; they were referred to as pimps. So that was the language, pimping out, pimp daddy. Like that was very much the language that was used, back, back. I'm going to say really where there was a lot of print media. And then
I use that language all the time, even though I started reporting on human trafficking in I guess it would have been early 2008, shortly after.
Right.
I think it had come into the criminal code in 2005, but the first conviction
That's
was in 2007,
Yep.
something like that in
Yep.
Canada.
Yep.
And for me, it was actually because it wasn't like, I want to say it wasn't until a couple of years later that a lot of my sources would start referring to them as traffickers instead
Yep.
of pimps. But I do feel like I made a conscious choice to use the word pimp because
Yep.
I wanted to, like, pop culture said that
Yes.
pimping was cool, right? And I wanted to show that actually pimping's not cool. What pimping is quite often violence and threats and coercion and all of that stuff. Anyway, continue.
So and there was, this focus on group home youth and runaways and addicts. And so that was that's how it was all couched. Like that was the demographic of those who were being trafficked, right? And so that was back, I'm going to say the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. And it took a long time, I'm going to say. So you're right, the Criminal Code 2005, human trafficking is legislated, but still that language and that, I'm going to say, lack of empathy continued. I was involved in a case in 2008, and it involved a girl. She was underage, and she came from a very middle-class family. So I remember that going in the media, and I remember the family was horrified. The parents were, very middle class, and they couldn't believe that any of this had happened to, their daughter. And the fallout from that case being so much in the media, because it was really quite devastating for the parents and for a sibling, because it was a case that I guess the public was very interested in at that time. And I remember that case, and I remember the media being around, and I remember the young woman being absolutely petrified because there was the media there, and there were just like all eyes on her. And when she gave her testimony, the case did have some unique features and circumstances to it, which made it, I think, a point of interest. But it was really it was a very difficult situation.
We'll be right back. So talk to me about why it was difficult, because the survivor in that would not have been identified, right? So her family members wouldn't have been identified. So what was the impact of the media?
But so this is how they ended up being identified, right? Because as I said, it was a unique set of circumstances. So, the location of where they lived was revealed in the media. And
like, how specific?
Pretty specific. Yeah.
Like the city or the neighborhood or
the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is a microcosm of the city of Toronto. I'll just say that. So there's no, maybe, a community of 250 people, maybe. There's you would absolutely know, who this family is. So they ended up being I'm going to say outed. And as I say, because it was reporting on not your runaway, group home stereotype that was,
Mm-hmm.
perpetuated in the media. This was a very middle class family that found themselves in these circumstances, and um, were horrified by the what they felt was their total lack of control over anything. So, as we know, having been in the court system, we have no control. We have basically very little say about
Mm-hmm.
how things unfold and when things start and begin and delays and all of that. So, it's just it's a bit of a runaway train where
Mm-hmm.
you just feel that you just don't have, yeah, the guardrails are completely off.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the media could have handled that case differently? It sounds like there's a lot of ways, but what would, in your mind, the ideal media coverage look like for that sort of case?
Not to have identified where the family lived.
That was the big one. That was
It
that
was a
was
big
the
one
thing.
because it was yeah, yeah. That was a big one. And also, I mean, she was just terrified of the trafficker. She
Mm.
was terrified of having to testify. Um, and yeah, she just was, the fear factor was so significant. And the parents were also very fearful because, now the trafficker knew what community she came from, even if she had never disclosed her address to him.
Mm.
He knew where she was,
Wow.
for sure, for sure. So that was pretty big. He was convicted
Yeah. So
anyway.
so that was in like the early 2000s, like in the
That was like
2000s
2008. Yeah.
ish. And so I mean social media is on the scene, but not to the extent that it is
No,
today.
no,
So
it was
how
like,
did you see it change, the coverage over the years since then?
so can I hopscotch backwards
Of
to about
course.
1997? So
Absolutely.
that's the first case that I had involvement with the media.
I think
Um,
I feel like I know what case you're talking about just because that date sticks in my head for
yep,
a couple okay, so
yep.
continue.
I think you'll figure it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was another very high profile case in the media. It also had very unique features to its story, and um, so she was an underage sex worker. Um, they referred to her as, a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the media when all of this was being written up, and
Mm-hmm.
um, the accused, he was convicted, but so yet again there was a lot of interest in this case. He It had to do with, it involved a firearm impersonating a police
Yeah.
officer. um, so I remember the being in court, the media was there, the defense, counsel was there. So it's just this onslaught of, like, all eyes are on you as the complainant, right? And this was also, I don't want to say a test run, but I mean, she was a minor, and um yeah, and there was still, this sense of, well, what did she think was going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms um of being assaulted, so brutally assaulted the way that she was.
It is
um
just to frame that a little bit more, because the reason I'm familiar with this case is because this accused, as you know, I can see the look in your face, was
yes, this
involved
is
in
the
later
one.
cases. Yeah.
Yep.
And one of the later cases I wrote a lot about. And I remember there was a story from 97 or whenever he was convicted that I
Yep.
quoted from, probably in more than one story, more than a decade later. Uh, in and basically describing what he had done at that
Yes.
time. And anyway, I remember in that story specifically, it was framed as a sex worker,
Yes.
basically a bad date, quote unquote, what would be referred to as a bad date, where she thought that she was being picked up by a John, and this horrible thing happened. But yes, I very much remember that framing. So it's interesting to hear your perspective on that now, because I didn't really
Right.
think much of it at the time.
So interesting. So as I was preparing for this, I came across one of your articles
Mhm.
and I was reading it. I'm going, oh my gosh, that's the case. I
Yes.
was there in 1997.
Yeah.
And then, fast track, right, to when
I want to say even 2014 or something.
it
There was
was
a dangerous
2014,
offender
and then
hearing.
the day, and he was declared a dangerous offender.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting in terms of the media coverage and all of that. So the young woman from 1997, so people were looking for her because they knew there was another, there was a survivor from that time.
Like
And
media, the media was looking for her.
well, I think the media, the police definitely were,
Right.
because they wanted a statement from her, because she never gave a victim impact statement.
Mm.
So, I was still working, with her. I'm still in
Mhm.
touch with her. So,
And just to
anyway,
give people who aren't familiar with the criminal justice system a bit of background there, a bit of context, a dangerous offender hearing is, somebody might be found guilty of a crime, but the Crown wants to show that this is a pattern of behavior and they should be given an
right,
indeterminate sentence. So the Crown in 2014 or whenever it was that I was covering that case would have wanted to go back to the 97 case that he had been
correct.
convicted in, or 98, 99, and get a statement from that victim survivor, so that
Yes,
they could use it in the dangerous offender hearing.
that's right. And that was so that clinched it because they were able to establish from 1997 up until I think it was like 2014 or whatever,
That's when the case
13.
finally came, but I think that
Yeah,
he was in custody by like 2008 or 2009,
but he
something like that.
kept getting released and kept reoffending. So I think
Yes.
that was established a that pattern of behavior. But I think, going back to the victim survivor from 1997, she could see that there was, I mean, because he ended up being declared a dangerous offender, but like her fear factor was like oh my God, they're reporting on this. Like, I just want to be in, like, she was really, really, really scared. She was
Mm.
really scared. Well, she was scared of him, number one, right? And she was scared of any potential uh, exposure about what had happened to, in 1997. But she did consent and she did agree. And, sort of in the end for her, it was like, get him. Like, he
Yes.
keeps hurting people. Like, the reason why I came forward in 97 was to stop this behavior, and it still has continued. So I don't want anyone else to be a victim of this man. So
Mhm.
that's what, you know.
You know, it's just, and I talk about this a lot in my book, and I know you know this, Michelle, and you and I have talked a lot about it, like the guilt that I have carried over the years that I've
Yes.
managed to get through, like with some good advice from people like you. The whole guilt, not growth, not guilt idea I heard from my friend Elin Green. But when I give like workshops now to journalists, one of the things I tell them is to be mindful of bringing cases back into the news from maybe a few weeks ago or months ago or years ago, when there are survivors out there, whether they are survivors of homicide or traffic fatality or human trafficking, for example, who aren't necessarily expecting their case to be back in the news, and suddenly they are seeing a picture of their murdered loved one under a blanket, or their
Yeah.
the car wreckage where their child was killed, Or, and I actually bring up like it's not a real photo, but an illustration of, you know, the person that they still fear, their abuser, is suddenly back in the headlines and their trauma responses are firing because they're still very afraid of this person. Or maybe they haven't been thinking about it and now suddenly it's back in. And that's exactly what you're describing. And that's exactly what I did.
Yes.
Like, I know this guy's face because we
Yes.
ran his mugshot
Yep.
many times
Yes.
when I was, I think when I was working in print, but then also I know I covered that as a television reporter. And
Yes.
yeah, so it's, how telling is that?
I know, right?
Lessons learned right here.
Lessons learned. And so it's interesting, you know, as you reflect on that for myself. So I think back to that time with her and, you know, back in 97 and then, 2012, sort of around that time frame where, you know, there was a lot of pressure and I felt the pressure as well. Like you were there, you know her. And so yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. And so you don't want to do harm and but you know, people have their own agendas and anyway, yeah, it's this tightrope and it's all about consent, right?
Yeah.
But then, you know, what are you consenting to? I mean, another young woman who I worked with, she did consent to it was a print media, and she really didn't understand what she had consented to.
So tell me about
So
that.
I read it last night. It just was, because I mean, her words are so powerful, and it seemed like a good idea at the time
Had
for
her
her.
trafficker been convicted? Like, was this?
Yes, so this is, I mean, I probably should have said this at the very beginning, but this does play into this topic of journalism and reporting. So I was the advocate that supported the first human trafficking conviction in Toronto.
Mm,
So
yeah.
that case just generated for years tons of interest. So um, I'm just putting like shedding that light. But anyway, yes, so she consented thinking it was a really good idea. And then she saw the article in print and then she was devastated. She was just like, what did I just do? What did I just do? She was just beside herself.
What was she upset about? Was it regretting sharing her name? Was it the details that were shared? Was
She
it the
did,
quotes that were used?
so she didn't use her name, but
Okay.
she didn't use her name. But yet again, this was someone from a small community. So when it came out, she was outed in the community and she ended up having to leave.
Wow.
She
Wow.
was that girl, right?
Really?
Lots of judgment and prejudice. Um, so she left.
We'll be right back. It's such a powerful lesson about, because as a journalist, so many times I would go to talk to somebody, victim, survivor, witness, whatever, and it's okay, I won't use your name. And it's like, we feel like, as journalists, we feel like we're putting up this barrier where they're totally safe. Like, it's okay, we're not identifying you, we're not using your name, so you can speak freely. But clearly that wasn't the case for her. And actually, I can share another story that I think I've spoken with you about. It's also in my book, where I had interviewed a human trafficking survivor. I want to say it was like the night that the evening after her trafficker had been convicted. And this was one of the first cases. And I was working at the Toronto Sun, which is part of the whole, I don't remember what it was referred to back then, Sun media chain or Quebec or whatever, but it printed
Right.
across the country. The big stories did anyway. And I interviewed her and asked her, how do you want to be identified? You want to just like pick a pseudonym or your middle name or whatever? And she said, I want to be identified by my first name only. It's vague enough, like people won't know who it is. and she was from another province. She had been trafficked in the Greater Toronto area, but she was from another province. And I'll never forget. I mean, it went to print the next morning, and then it appeared online. And I had gone to my sister-in-law's place for dinner. And just as I was walking in, like I'd finished work for the day, and just as I was walking in, my phone rings and it's her. And I said, "Hey, like, what's going on?" And she was devastated because she didn't realize that the story would run in her home province. And she
Right.
felt like she had been outed and everybody's going to know that it's her. And I just felt like I had so let her down, and she felt so let down. It was awful because this was a story that was supposed to empower her, and she wanted to share it because she wanted to show other potential victims what the red flags were for this sort of thing. And she was absolutely devastated. I felt awful. And of course, there was nothing I could do to pull it from print. It was once it's out there, it's out. I did get it taken down from the website, from what I recall. But it was awful. And it's one of those lessons of just how careful we need to be. So before you shared that story, you mentioned the word consent. You were talking about the survivor from the 90s, and, you know, consent and all that. A journalist reporting on a story today, say about a dangerous offender hearing, might not think, they would probably argue pretty vehemently that, well, we don't need consent from all the victims in these various cases to write about the case. That's so impractical to have to go back and get consent to write about it. Not only that, but it's public record. So when you're referring to consent, do you think that that's actually what should happen? Or is it more a matter of just making sure that they know it's going back in the media? And is that the responsibility of the media, or is that responsibility of, you know, the Crown that is seeking this dangerous offender status, or the survivor support worker? Like, where does that fall, that responsibility?
I think very good question. So I know, you know, as part of the anti-human trafficking team where I've just left from, there was, you know, collaboration between ourselves and, let's say, the officer in charge of these cases. So they would, if they couldn't reach the survivor complainant, then they would, you know, reach out to me or my colleagues, and then we would let them know that, you know, there's going to be a media release or a media blitz, or, you know, this is going to be reported on. So just giving them the heads up. And I think it's the giving the heads up that's really important. And I hear what you're saying, Tamara, and I that's unwieldy. I mean, the court it's an open record, but I would say that any storytelling, so, you know, there's, you know, the Crown's position, the defense position, you know, that can be reported on, like, that's, but I would say anything that's, I don't know,
like details of
like
what happened. Like me saying back in 1997, this is what he did to somebody.
Right. Yeah. So
that I should maybe go up to somebody like you or the Crown and say, do you have a way of letting this woman know that I'm going to be writing this? I don't want it to be harmful for her. I just want her to have the heads up so that she can choose to avoid it if she wants, or just if there's not that element of surprise.
Because it is that element of surprise. It's just like, what? And I mean, I've actually just recently had that, like, what? This isn't what is going on? So, I mean,
in seeing a story in the news, you mean?
It's just like, and was given the heads up, which was great, but I was really surprised that this ended up being in the media. So anyway, so it is about, you know, if there's the heads up, then, you know, the people, the complainant, the families. So it's not just about, I really want to touch on, you know, you have the survivor, victim, and then there's, you know, family members, siblings, parents, and the impact on them is huge. So the fallout of, you know, this level of exploitation, is just so damaging all the way around. So I mentioned the young woman that consented to that interview and ended up leaving her small community, really never to go back. There'll never be a place at the dinner table for her again. And it's just heartbreaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just heartbreaking. And it's not because the family doesn't love her or don't care for her. They do. But, there's just a lot of damage and they just can't, you know, humans have limits in terms of what they can accept and not accept, right? And that's what we don't know,
Yeah.
right? That's what we don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very impactful.
Yeah. And it can ripple in so many different directions.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Michèle, there was another thing on my long journey of learning about this stuff. One of the first lessons that really shocked me about the coverage of something like human trafficking is actually when you and I first met. So I'll tell this story, and you feel free to jump in, pick it up if you feel like I'm missing anything. But so I had written my first book, All the Bumpy Pebbles, which was fiction, a novel that was inspired by the true stories shared with me by survivors. But I had these like paper clipped portions that included real court documents, from real cases. And I believe that the accused were identified in these, but the complainants, victims, survivors were not, other than by like the initials that the court had agreed to use at the time. And I believe I had sent the book to the manager of the anti-human trafficking team at the nonprofit you were working at.
Right.
And they sent it off to you because I don't know if they realized that you were involved in one of these cases from one of these paper clipped.
They would have known. Absolutely.
Okay. So then maybe that's why they shared it with you.
Yep.
And why don't you just pick up the story from here, Michèle? You get the copy of this book and you start reading it through, and what's going through your mind, and where does it go from there?
So the thing that struck me was that, as you say, these paper clips, they were identifying the trafficker. And so that for me was alarming and concerning. And I
Why?
felt
Why? Where were those alarm bells coming from?
so they came from the fact that this was their story, and that by people are going to read this book, and there'd been so much harm for them that had been done. They just wanted to be invisible, and they didn't want any part of any of this storytelling at all. And I remember, they shared with me, this is our story, this is our right, and nobody has a right to write about me without asking my permission, and nobody has asked my permission. And by the way, I don't give my permission. It was very, very clear. And they were absolutely, they were like bereft, like they were just they were so upset at the prospect that the identity of the convicted traffickers was going to be included in this in the book. So yeah,
so you reached out to me,
and I reached out to you, and
you told me that. And I'll just say first that like I was devastated to hear this. It hurts my heart even now, even though I know what the outcome was, but like it hurts my heart even now to hear this, because as many journalists who are listening to this can relate, when we write these stories, and when I'm writing this book, I'm doing it. I mean, I've come to realize now it's probably just as much, if not more, about working through my own trauma around the subject as it was about educating the public. But I wanted to shout from the rooftops, this is actually happening. We need to invest more in this. People pay attention. It's because I so cared about the women and girls. And there's, of course, any number of people that are trafficked, but by and large, women and girls who are being victimized by this, that I was writing it. So to hear from you that they were devastated by this, I was like, who am I doing this for? So you and
Right.
I talked, and then what happened?
So then you agreed not to include um, the traffickers' names in the book, and I took that back to the young women, and they were so grateful. They were so thankful. They felt heard. They felt validated. And it was just an immense relief. And it was really, it was an incredible, that was an incredible journey, I have to say, Tamara. And I just think I know for them, they felt heard. And for once, um, that story, that narrative that had been reported like so many times in the media, they felt now that they had control and they had a say, and that you respected their wishes.
And we are talking about
Yeah.
something that is so simple. I took out the name of the trafficker and I replaced it with some anonymous initials. And I think that I went through all of the paperclip portions after that. And I basically, from the beginning of the book, the first paperclip portions, the initials were AB, and then the next person referred to was CD, and the next one was
Yeah.
EF, so that it was completely anonymized, because there were cases in there. Like after I spoke with you, I'm like, well, how do I find the survivors from these other court cases? Because I went through and I remember reaching out to a couple investigators, like, were you involved in this? Who I knew. And I realized I'm not going to be able to get their consent. So at the time I was thinking, okay, if I just completely anonymize it. And I think that with your case too, there might have been an identifier by location, like either a city that they were from or a
It was
town, something
definitely.
like that. And
Yeah,
so I'd
yeah,
taken out
yeah.
that. So I made sure I took out all of that. But even so, like that, like, so that little change on my part made such a difference
It did.
for the survivors in your case.
Yeah.
And wow, like what a powerful lesson for journalists. Like you don't need to do all these things. It's not that you're not talking about it at all. It's a matter of like letting them know and seeing what they think and how would they like for it to be presented. Because for me,
Yes.
that didn't change any of the actual content of the book. No random reader is going to care what this guy's name is.
No.
It's just it's the facts that matter, right? But
Yeah.
then what I'll also say is, and like this is something that I've talked to you about too, I think. I've bounced so much off you over the years, Michèle, but that book it doesn't sit right with me still. And there's like my
Interesting.
sister who says, because my sister like recommends it to so many people. She was a
Yes.
teacher, now she's a psychologist, and she interacts with so many people who it would benefit from reading this book so that they can understand what the warning signs are of human trafficking potentially, and talk to their kids about it and stuff like that. She's like, you absolutely cannot unpublish it, but I've come this close to just unpublishing it, because I just feel like I wasn't trauma informed when I wrote it. And there must be so many ways that I would do things differently now if I were to do it over again. And
Right.
so I've talked to you about this. I think I've talked to my sister about it, and and she's told me, no, don't do it. Don't do it. She's like, okay, then go back and redo it. But I haven't been able to bring myself to read it.
To
Like
do.
isn't that, it sounds crazy because it's still out there. And it's not like I have it out there because I'm making millions of dollars. I think I probably get like $5 in royalties a month on this thing. If that, I have no idea, but it's just there. And I haven't been able to bring myself to look at it. Which sounds awful, right? But it
No,
is,
it can be really hard to like. I so relate to that, to like circle back to some of this stuff. It's just like, oh,
yeah, you don't
right.
want to
It's
revisit some of it,
You don't
right?
want to revisit, no, and also you want to. You're also protecting yourself and protecting your heart, and I completely understand that,
But in my
100%.
case, like with you, you're protecting yourself and your heart, but your actions wouldn't have harmed anybody else. I worry about, I'm not even going to get into it all, but like
No, because
this
I've read your
book,
book and I don't know. Yeah, I read it when it came out, and I've shared your book, and um yeah, for some people it's like, oh my gosh, this is, and I'm talking sharing it with first responders, right? Like police officers, and so they totally get it, and the brutal honesty of it. Like that's, I'm just going to share that with you. But I
Thank you.
I do hear where you're coming from, but it's very, very hard hitting, and it's not an easy book to read at all. Um, so one of my dear friends, he said, it's just damn depressing, but
It really is. Why do I
no,
only
but
write depressing books? Both of them are.
but she nailed it. She nailed it. So
Uh,
there you
so
go.
I
I'm
hear
just,
that, and I get that, like from readers, from the handful of people who have read that book and reach out to me. It's very impactful for them. I actually recently just reconnected with a woman who was part of, she was actually she's a survivor who had sat with me and shared some of her stories many, many years ago when I first started thinking about writing this book. And we reconnected, and I sent her a copy of the book, which is, I mean, that in and of itself, I should have sent it years ago, but, and she read it, and she said, because I was afraid of her reading it, that it would be harmful for her because she would see
right.
her own stories, which she had
Yeah.
wanted me to use, reflected, and that would be harmful. But she was so happy. And she said too, like, you nailed it. This is it. I want everybody to read it. But it's the people who I haven't been able to reach, that I wasn't able to reach, that I worry about. Because, okay, so circling back to now the way that you and I, our paths crossed, and might I just say, we're talking way too much about me and not about you, but I hope that people get lessons about this. But Michèle, like this sense of, it's something I've heard many times when talking to people about like human trafficking, and whether I'm talking to survivors or talking to support workers who have relayed the concerns of survivors. And it's the idea of them being talked about behind their back. And this isn't just with human trafficking survivors, but all sorts of survivors, like them being surprised by their case sort of being back in the news, or even learning that it was being talked about in a university class, or it was referenced in a book. I've heard that for sure from survivors. And it's like what you said, like, what right do they have to use my story? And it's like, why am I not included in this conversation? We'll be right back. Is that a common sentiment that you heard from survivors over the years whose stories were in the media? Like, does that go along with the loss of control, the idea of, like, these people are just talking about me behind my back and I'm not part of the conversation?
100%, right? That's exactly the point. The point being, how would we feel, like people telling stories behind our back, or because that it's their story to tell. It's not my story or your story. It's their story, and if you're going to tell it, then you need to get their consent to do that.
Mm-hmm. Which is and this is one of those areas for journalists that is very difficult. The idea of whose story is it? Because if they don't want to talk, that's one thing. Okay, you don't need to be a part of the story. But then journalists would argue, I know I certainly would have, that, well, we don't need your consent to talk about what happened because it's a matter of public record.
That's right.
Just like police can lay a charge without getting consent from a victim. It's not necessarily likely because they'd rather have that survivor on board with them. But so it's very slippery in that regard. But okay, so speaking of slippery slopes, there's another slippery slope I wanted to talk to you about. You and I have discussed in the past the idea of, a survivor sharing their story publicly and being identified. And you have told me how you would be very reluctant. And I share this concern as well when I work with survivors of sexual violence in particular, because these are the living survivors versus, a homicide victim is dead using their name, but you would be very reluctant to encourage them to use their name publicly because of you thinking about the harm that can come to them maybe years down the road, even though they might be in a place right now where they're like, I want to share my story. It's empowering. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And like, because the slippery slope I want to touch on here is the idea of, infantilizing survivors and us saying, we know better, you shouldn't use your name, versus, that the empowering, but also knowing that they could regret it down the road. So can you just share your thoughts on that?
So I think there was a moment in time when there was a lot of media scrutiny on a lot of these cases. And so I was inundated with requests for, to speak to, various survivors. And I was always reluctant based on like the history of everything, that I've done and worked with survivors. I was reluctant to reach out to them, but that doesn't mean that I didn't. And in speaking to them in terms of asking the question, is this something that you want? I was really very transparent and very honest about, one, yes, this can be very empowering. What is your, and just asking lots of open-ended questions for them to think about, not just in the moment of, wanting to share their story, but sort of in a very measured way. What does this look like down the line for you? Do you want to be a survivor advocate? That's amazing. You are making a choice in terms of, sharing your story and embracing, being, let's say, an advocate or wanting people to benefit from your life experience. But if you're unsure, do you want to really go forward? So those are the kinds of conversations that I would have. And also, on a positive note, with regards to the sharing of stories, they get to control the narrative for the most part, right? Which I think is really empowering.
But only to an extent, though, right? Like they don't get to choose which quotes are used, or
right.
I mean, this is something I'm advocating to change, but
So I guess, getting back to that interview that was, done by that young woman who just then was absolutely devastated. I mean, at that moment, I had that very open conversation with her, but she did consent. But I also know that after the fact, she felt pressure. She felt she needed to validate herself. She needed to explain why all of this happened and that she wasn't a bad, she wasn't, morally corrupt. And I mean, that was, I think, part of that motivation for her, in talking with her afterwards about it. So, what is your motivation to consenting to this? What and then if you're going to do this, then you need to really prep for it, right? Because I've certainly seen these situations go completely off the rails and in a really bad way.
What do you mean by that?
Just that in the heat of the moment, it seemed like a good idea, and then the story ends up being incredibly salacious and I'm going to say like almost like cringeworthy is the word I'm going to use, and very and sensationalized, and then some of this is like in online. Some of it is televised as part of a news story, and so then those news stories, they, as you were saying, end up at a university, in a university course as part of their curriculum. And it's like, what? Like, are you kidding me? And I mean, I had a young woman who this is exactly what happened to her. She consented to telling her story, and I've shared this one with you. And then she ended up, she was in university, and she was in
like years later.
We're talking like maybe a decade later, and there she is. She's sitting, in the lecture hall, and there she is, full screen. There she is. She did not consent to that.
And what was her reaction?
She made a beeline to me and was absolutely crushed. She said, "You have got to make this go away." Well, I can't. I can't. But they just took that story and made it part of their curriculum.
Yeah.
And I think that is for me, like, that's the cautionary tale. Like, know that if you're going to do this, that these are all the checks and balances. You need to ask these questions. You need to, what are you consenting to? Be
Yes.
very, very clear, right?
And if somebody is, let's say an 18-year-old woman who's still
Yes.
very much in her trauma, maybe the court case has
Yes.
just ended, but that is, how do you explain to them that maybe 10 years down the road, you're trying to adopt a child, or you're trying to do this or that, and somebody's poking in. And it sounds awful to say, like, you might not want this to be something that pops up, even though they did nothing wrong. But
Right.
that is the reality, right? And
Yep.
it's the awful reality, but there's only so much you can do. I actually just had a situation very recently where I was supporting a survivor of a completely different type of event. And she wanted to share her name publicly, but is still very much in her trauma.
Right.
And she did an interview, and I was there with her. And she feels good now, but I worry about when
Yep.
that story comes out, or months or years down the road, when she's not wanting to be the poster person for this sort of
Yes.
thing.
Yep.
When she wants that right to be forgotten, I worry about, was it what will it have been the right thing for her to have shared the story at this time? There's
Yep.
a lot to consider.
A
And
lot.
there's not necessarily like hard rules that journalists should necessarily follow when it comes to this stuff. But I think the biggest thing is to be mindful of the
Yes.
power that your stories have to harm or to heal.
Yes. Yes.
Um, but let's talk about Michèle, because I just mentioned the right to be forgotten.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the right to be forgotten, because this is something that an issue you've been working on for years. And
Yes.
you recently came to me with concerns about a young woman, and we're not going to name her for
No.
reasons which will be obvious. But tell me about this young woman and why she's part of your plight for the right to be forgotten, and what we
The,
mean by that term, right to be
and what we
forgotten.
mean, yeah. And I also just want to uh put it out there that I have her consent to speak on her behalf with
Yes.
regards to this
Yeah, we
story, because
discussed that
we did
beforehand.
discuss,
I
yeah,
didn't want to ask you this question without her being on board with this conversation.
exactly. And so she's definitely on board, because she thinks it if this story can help others, then that's exactly what she wants. So I don't know the entire history of the right to be forgotten, but I know back in 2017, the right to be forgotten was an application that you could make in Europe, and I think other jurisdictions in parts of the world, where if there was a social media information that was damning to your life, that it was impeding your ability to get employed. And it could be anything. It could be that you've been charged and convicted of, I don't know, possession of, marijuana, or that you had been involved in an assault, or what it doesn't, or that you were engaged in sex work and your identity had been hijacked onto other websites.
Mm.
So in 2017, and so I've been working, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but this young woman that I've been working with, I've been working with her since around 2015. We're now 2024. So she was initially charged with, she was charged with human trafficking. So I just want to lay that table in terms of this young woman. So her image is out there. In
Because
2007,
police had released her image, they were
yes,
looking
and
for
so it
her.
was like this mugshot, and she has a very unusual name. So if you Google her name, it's the first thing that comes up. And for whatever reason, there were like, I don't know, 10, 11 images of her that were just boom, 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 since 2015, 16, when she was charged. In 2016, her charges were withdrawn because she actually was the complainant. She was a victim of human trafficking. She was not a perpetrator. And she,
which is not uncommon in human trafficking, right? It's
no,
very
but
convoluted.
do no harm. So this is the thing. Her image was out there for all these years, and we were trying to get it removed to no success whatsoever.
What were you doing? Like what were the
So
efforts that you were making?
I would go to the different news outlets, and I was looking for that, link that, correction of a story.
Mm.
And I was going into these links and I'm saying, please remove this. This is not da 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 da. And then I never heard back, not from a single one, not
Wow.
from a single one. So then,
And these are mainstream media outlets.
yeah, these are all mainstream media outlets. And then the other thing we then went and did was the officer in charge of this case actually ended up writing a letter explaining that we ended up using to approach these social media platforms and mainstream media platforms to validate, like, it's just not me saying as her advocate that this is the case. This is like police letterhead explaining everything. And then in 2017, Canada explored the idea of the right to be forgotten and applying it to Google to have images and stories removed from their websites that were doing harm. Google absolutely would not cooperate. We did try, like, it was something that we did try. So this complainant in 2017 that applied to Google for the right to be forgotten, to have his information removed, he appealed the decision and it went to the Court of Appeal. And I can tell you that in September, not hot off the press, but pretty close, September of 2023, the Court of Appeal sided with the right to be forgotten.
Oh, I wasn't even aware of that.
Yes, well, so now we can apply the right to be forgotten.
Wow.
To have the rest of her information de-indexed. Is that the right word? That
I don't know.
Anyway.
Sounds right.
Yeah. So anyway, but it took two lawyers, a police officer, an advocate, and herself from 2016. And you were so pivotal in this because honestly, once you got involved, Tamara, like boom, 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 as you, like 6 or 7 of them came like off, like within 24 hours. I was just like, we could not believe it was like.
But that was frustrating because you came to me and said you'd been working on this for many years, trying to get these images and her name removed.
Yeah.
And I looked at the news websites and I sent an email and I included the same letter from the police officer. And it was like immediate. They're, oh yeah, no problem. And I'm like, why? Yes. Okay. So I'm reaching out to people that I know. And I was grateful for them that they took it down. Some people I didn't know, but I guess maybe with my signature saying the work that I do, I'm an advocate, and they would probably see pretty quickly that I was a former journalist. It shouldn't take somebody like me reaching out to do that. You had already done the work that it should have taken to get it removed. And that's what's frustrating, because there's so many people out there who don't know that somebody like I exist who will help you out. So it shouldn't be a me thing either. Like it should be, there's so many moving parts there, which for me starts with the Crown withdrawing that charge. This always frustrated me as a journalist, because police would put out a news release when somebody was charged, but when that charge was withdrawn at the request of the Crown, we never got an email from the Ministry of the Attorney General saying this charge has been withdrawn. And that person's charge lives online forever until years down the road, they reach out to us on, Twitter or emailing us or calling the newsroom. And they're saying, here, look, these are my legal documents. Can you please take this down? It's not the way that it should be. So I hope that what
Nope.
you're describing with this right to be forgotten stuff, that it'll make it a lot easier for trauma survivors to be forgotten, to have the right to be forgotten.
The right to be forgotten. And I think the thing is that, I mean, her image being out there the way it was, it really impeded her ability to move forward in her life. Because her, I mean, she got fired from jobs, and she would end up, you know, working at different places, and people would do a Google search on her. And then she was just, you know, people treated her horribly, right?
Wow.
Um, and, you know, we had to get, you know, a lawyer. I mean, when she would get fired, you know, lawyer would, you know, end up, you know, firing off a letter to, you know, the company that was involved, and, you know, threatening to, you know, employment standards, right? And I mean, and people just wouldn't even listen to what she had to say. Like, she would be like fired on the spot, like
Wow.
no due process at all. I think that that was what was ended up being so damaging and crippling. And then, you know, her family, like, she has parents, she has a sibling, and the impact of that, like, you know, that's my sister.
Mm-hmm.
I can't look her up because that's all there, like, that's all there is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, you know, it's taken all these years, we've just like literally, I know I emailed you when it happened, like, she called me and she said, you won't believe it. And I couldn't believe it. I just like overjoyed, right?
Yes.
It just like, and it's life changing. So, you
It's
know,
finally gone.
and it's
She's
finally
finally
gone.
ungoogleable.
Yeah. And so the thing is that her life has been so pigeonholed in terms of, she only felt that she had one role that she could fulfill. And it's not what she wants to do. She
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't want to do what she's doing now. And now the world is going to open up for her. And she's just, it's so liberating, you know, just so I'm just like, ugh, it was just amazing. Yeah.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
again, such a lesson for the media and
Yeah.
police officers and survivor support workers of the impact of these seemingly little things, a name here, a mugshot there.
Yeah.
They just, you know, we get so used to it in the media putting these things out. And I'm not saying that the media was wrong to put out her mugshot. I mean, that's another discussion entirely. But
Right.
the system failed her after that when it
And
remained up.
and it remain, we're talking years, we're not talking months. I think that's the
Yeah.
thing, right? It's just, it's like, it's just,
Yeah.
it just narrowed her life in such a big way.
Yes.
And I mean, it impacted her. I mean, there's still some things that we have to unravel, but, you
Yeah.
know, it's just, but I guess the other thing is that, um you know, kudos to her. Like, you know, I would just, the two of us were just like, we're just going to keep doing this until we get it done. We're
Yes.
just going to keep doing it. We'll get this done. And I have to say, both of us had moments of going, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
if this is ever going to be doable, but we just kept at it.
And can I
So,
just point out too, Michèle, because I don't think we've mentioned it, that you're retired and you're still such an advocate for these survivors. You care so much. And this is how you spend your retirement. I mean, you do other things as
yes,
well, but I just think you're such a remarkable person. And I just so appreciate you and your work. We've covered so much in this conversation. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to touch on, Michèle?
I think so. Yes, there's one thing. So I think I do want to give a shout out to, you know, survivors who um, make the choice to share their story, reveal their identity, um, whether they, you know, are part of the survivor advocate community or not. Um, I just want to give a shout out to them because I think what they have to do is incredibly important. And I do know in working with survivors that it's been enormously helpful, um, for so many of them to have had the benefit of having their story, these stories shared with them. They just affirming, and yeah, it makes a huge difference. So, I mean, I know I've talked a lot about, the downside of like some of this media interaction and the profound negative, trauma that can happen, with this kind of exposure. But I also want to say that I think there are ways and pathways forward where it can be done in a very thoughtful, mindful, meaningful, supportive way.
I love that, because that is the power of telling these very important stories when we can tell
Yes.
them right. There's
Yes.
so much, like, these stories are so important, but the people who are involved in them, whether, the primary survivor or the secondary victims or even the journalists, are so very vulnerable. And the
Yes.
survivor support workers, these stories make them so very vulnerable that you need to be so very careful. And so I should ask you then, because it all comes down to, I think a lot of it comes down to, that idea of being trauma informed in your approach. So, Michèle, what does the term trauma informed journalism mean or look like to you?
That's a big question. I'm not a journalist, so
Trauma informed storytelling. What would you like to see the process look like?
oh, I mean, consent number one, but it's not just consent in terms of telling the story, but what does consent mean, right? So consent can mean different things. Consent can be, oh, I'm just going to tell your story. But I think it's really important. So what does that look like, to consent to your story being told? Are there any implications? Are there any downside to that being, to telling your story? What control, as you're the storyteller, do I get to review what you're going to write? Because maybe you've misinterpreted what I've said, or you're going to take something that's out of context. So I think those are, I know when I'm, when I'm working with survivors, I just sort of, I just laid that groundwork. This is what, these are all the possibilities and the options. And I think it can be a misconception. Well, you're just going to help others. If you do this, you're helping others. It just seems, I don't know, I think it can be disingenuous, because I think that, that's pressure, right? So I think it just has to be a very, I don't know, just really mindful, just really mindful, and no arm twisting. I've seen lots of arm twisting.
Mindful on
Right?
the part of the survivor support worker, mindful on the part of the journalist.
Yes, all of the
Everybody.
above. Yeah,
Yes.
all of the above. All of the above. Yeah.
Michèle, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's good.
For this time, you and I know, have many more conversations to come, but I am so grateful for you. Thank you, Michèle, for appearing on this podcast, sharing your wisdom, your seemingly endless wisdom. I think that we could go on forever and ever, because you are just so chock full of these very important lessons. But thank you.
And thank you, Tamara, and lovely to see you. And I'm very, very happy to have been given the opportunity to do this. Yeah, it's great.
I love to hear that.